Thank you for having me. This sort of reminds me of talks I gave in 2009 and 2010. You know, after the fun was over, then Manfred comes up and delivers the bad news. And this is the title of the presentation this time. Let me point out that a year ago, the title was Let's Party Like It's 1999, and we had crossed out the 1999 and made it 2019. And that was clever, but different from what the title suggests. We never thought, or we never saw this coming. What the talk last year was about actually was to show that basically, even though there were a few signs that the economy might be stuttering, that really there were no real dangers in sight. And this is where we were. Some of you may not know this, but a recession is not 2 quarters of negative growth. There's an organization called the National Bureau of Economic Research. They have a dating committee, and they go all the way back to the 1860s to date all recessions in the United States and subsequent recoveries. And by last June, we had set a new record of the longest expansion ever experienced in the United States. And after that, we even went on for another 7 months with the expansion. And life looked good. The unemployment rate, which you can see on the left there, was 3.9%, 3.5% in the United States. These were numbers you hadn't seen since the 1960s. And at the same time, Consumer Sentiment Index, which is measured by the University of Michigan, where they ask consumers how they feel about purchases in the near future, were doing pretty well. They certainly had recovered after the Great Recession. And again, no sign of anything nasty coming up. Both the unemployment rate and the Consumer Sentiment Index, at least as you come towards the end of the recovery period, the boom, there are signs of leading economic indicators, meaning they will show if something is about to go bad. There was no evidence of that. And here's where we are now. I've sort of listed the major economic variables that we're looking at. And what stands out is, of course, the higher unemployment rates. Inflation is not a problem. Oil prices are low. Why are they low? Because there's very little demand for it. The Federal Reserve has gone as low as it can in terms of interest rates. There's a lower bound. They cannot go below zero. And there's a puzzle at the end, housing starts, and I will talk about that a little bit more later in detail. The stock market values that I have there are from the week before the election. Okay, so we went into the new year. The conference in Palm Springs was over. And still, there were rumors. You know, let me tell you that I bought my first face mask in January. Why did I buy it? Because I had Chinese students, and they would text me from China saying, you got to buy face masks. You got to be 95 face masks. And I did. So I ordered my first box when it was still cheap. So January, February, we were still doing fine. There was one concern. There's housing starts. If you go back all the way from the late 1950s to the period before the Great Recession, the average housing starts in the United States over this long period was 1.5 million. That's annualized. Divide that by 12 to get the monthly number. And what do you see? You see that we really experienced a much lower value of housing starts, or number of housing starts. And that's significant. I mean, it may very well explain why Trump never had a GDP growth of more than 3% except for one period, which is what that line is on the left side. So since 1896, the U.S. economy has grown at a rate of 3% on average. And Trump never achieved that except for one period. He initially wanted to have 4%, but that didn't happen. In his defense, growth after the Great Recession has been about a percentage point lower. And one of the reasons is that housing never picked up. I mean, it's a big puzzle. At the very end, February, we reached 1.5 million again, which was the average. But that was just before the start of the coronavirus. And then I made a presentation, so 7 days before the shutdown, 6 days before the shutdown, I couldn't remember anymore exactly. And it was, I think, on a Wednesday. And strange things started to happen if you watched the news. So this is sort of the same slide I presented at that talk on a Wednesday. What we had noticed was that the Central Bank of Australia had lowered the interest rates by 50 percentage points. That's a lot. Korea had committed to an 8 billion expenditure package. All of a sudden, the NBA stopped playing. If you looked at Europe, you would see that all of a sudden they had to play in front of empty stadiums. And if you have any idea about soccer, if Inter Milan plays Juventus, that is a sellout game, and it was in front of an empty stadium. And I watched this and I said, what is going on? The Federal Reserve gave a big talk about we're going to lower the interest rates as much as we can and be all supportive and so forth and so forth. And one of my concerns was, and this has been the concern since the coronavirus downturn, is, you know, we never were able to prepare our children for this, whether they were in high school or college, right? Because we never saw this coming. Asian parents actually did, because Asian parents went through SARS at the beginning of the millennium. And so they were much more prepared to wear face masks and so forth, right? In the Coachella Valley, you could see sort of problems coming up. I said at a time, at a public talk, the difference between a mild downturn and a very serious one is going to be my canary in the coal mine. And my canary in the coal mine was the Coachella Festival. And I said, if it takes place in April, we know this is a mild downturn. If it takes place in October, we will be okay. But if it doesn't take place in October, then we're in trouble. And I'm not talking about the impact that Coachella has on the local economy. That's huge to begin with, $700 million. I was simply talking about that as a signal of how bad things were going to be. Because if Coachella doesn't take place, you will have baseball in front of empty stadiums and so forth, right? And that is what happened. On the way back from that talk, I stopped by Trader Joe's, and that was the meat aisle. There was not a lot there. I also started to realize that in teaching economics, I can make different examples. We always talk about opportunity costs. And what is the opportunity cost that we have? Hamburger versus hot dogs, or tea versus coffee. I mean, we're much more serious about opportunity costs, right? I mean, these are two real alternatives. So there we go. Now came the bad. So GDP is only measured once every quarter, and publication is delayed. So we didn't get the numbers for the first quarter, but even when we got them, they didn't look so bad. And why is that? because the downturn really only started in the last 2 weeks in March. If you remember, the shutdown started for us on the 19th, right? Now, here was a stunning part. The economy in 2019 grew at a rate of 2%. Let's assume that for the first quarter, until the very end, those last 10 days, we grew at the same rate. Now, in order for the economy to end up at minus 5%, which is what it was for the first quarter, you had to have a decline of the economy of 40% for the last 2 quarters to reach that minus 5%. So it was huge, right? The same thing with unemployment, by the way. It didn't look so bad in March. It went up from 3.9% to, or 3.5% to 4.4%. 0.9 percentage point is a large increase by historical standards. But it didn't look that bad because the survey that is taken for measuring unemployment is taken on the 12th of every month. So that's important to remember. And on the 12th of March, we were still doing okay, right? Of course, here came the abyss. The second quarter of 2020 saw a decline in GDP of 31% annualized, unheard of. I mean, that's you call that the abyss, right? And at the same time, the unemployment rate goes from 4.4% to 14.7%. And you must realize when for the United States it goes up by that amount, the regional variation, as you were told before, for example, for the Coachella Valley, is much different. Imperial County, by historical standards, always has one of the highest unemployment rates in the United States. It went up to over 30%, the unemployment rate in Imperial County, right? So there's large variation, and there's not only variation by state, but also by metropolitan statistical area and so forth. Los Angeles was hit one of the hardest. The county of Los Angeles experienced, at that point, 20.4% unemployment. Unbelievable, right? This is interesting. Here's the first quarter. It tells you that the economy went down by, we know that, 5%. What was the part of the economy that went down? Which part? And if you look at the top, where consumption is, there's goods and there's services. So the entire decline in consumption came in services, of course. Goods was interesting. Non-durable goods, that's toilet paper, things like that, food, actually went up. It was non-durables that went down, right? And what saved us a little bit actually was foreign trade, because we imported more. We only had a decline of 5% in GDP. Here comes the second quarter. That's, of course, nasty, right? So this is what it looks like when the economy goes down by over 30%. And again, by the majority driven by consumption. Joe sort of mentioned this. I think if you want to explain to someone what this recession is all about, it's about 5 sectors. 5 sectors. And it will be easy for you to name those 5 sectors because all that you have to think about is what are the face-to-face sectors? And there's the biggest one, leisure and hospitality. Guess what? That's the one that saw the biggest decline. 8 million jobs lost in the United States, right? What else is there? Other services. Other services is not that big in terms of employment. That's why that bar that you see there does not go down by that much. Percentage-wise, other services suffered by even more, right? So these are hairdressers, manicure, pedicure, or the things you really care about, like tattoo parlors, things like that. So that's the second sector. The third sector, the one that showed actually the second highest decline here, is of course retail trade. We know that, right? Here are the two other sectors that perhaps you would not have named. One was health and education. Not surprising. You will say, coronavirus are about health. Why did that sector shrink by so much? Because we didn't want to go to hospitals anymore, unless you had to. So if you had a coronavirus problem, of course you ended up in the hospital if it was severe enough. But for any other ailment, you just tried to postpone it. Particularly, who was really affected were dental cares. People just didn't want to go to the dentist, right? So that's why that decline was there. We know this from other countries as well. I mean, in England, certain hospital wards had to shut down because there weren't enough patients there, right? The final sector is the one that is of a lot of interest for us in the long run, which is professional and business services. So this is when we will go back to work, where we'll have to have the distancing, we'll have to have special bathrooms and so forth, right? So 5 sectors in the future. Don't worry about manufacturing, which in the Coachella Valley you don't worry that much about anyway. Don't worry about construction, which is what you worry about here, right? But those were the 5 sectors. Government came later, right? Here's something interesting. So let's think of the Coachella Valley being part of Riverside County, which is part of the Inland Empire. How did employment look? So if we look for a start of employment before the Great Recession in 2007 and look at the downturn and compare the Inland Empire with the United States and California, what do you see? The Inland Empire was hit very hard, just like Coachella was. And it took us a long time to recover. Employment did not recover until 2014. It took us almost 6-7 years after the recession was over to get back to the same level of employment that we were before. And funnily enough, even though the Inland Empire suffered the most, all of a sudden it gets on this higher trajectory. And that continues until the coronavirus session. So we ended up as one of the strongest employment growth areas in the United States, except for, if you looked at the type of jobs we got, this picture is not mirrored by wages or income. So income went up by much more in California and in the United States, and you will say, how is that possible given the graph? It's because the wages that we received were much lower for the jobs that we had, right? Now here's the impressive thing. The United States and California went below the employment level they experienced in 2007. Wow. That's 13 years of employment growth, all wiped out in one go. Because we had ended up at a higher level in the Inland Empire, we didn't. We actually stayed above, right? So it's one of the few bright lights that we see. What about California compared to the other states? So, yeah, we're pretty much up there in the top 6, right? And look at the bottom. How can there be states that even in June had 4% unemployment? 4%. Stunning, right? So what I'm saying to you is there's not only variation by state, there's also large variation within state. And so geographically, this coronavirus has affected areas in a different way. Some of the usual suspects appear at the top, like Hawaii, Nevada, right? You would expect that. Massachusetts, so it's a bit surprising, right? So here is something that Joe hinted at before. What I did is I looked at all metropolitan statistical areas in California. We've got 29 of them. We've got 58 counties, but some of them are very small. And I looked at the 29 metropolitan statistical areas. And I looked at determinants to find who saw the biggest decline in employment from February to April. There are two MSAs that actually saw employment decrease by a little bit more for 1 month until May. So always went from February until the max, typically April. And what is the major determinant? The share in employment of leisure and hospitality. Right? The higher the share of employment in leisure and hospitality, the worse the decline in employment. And what I did is I looked at that relationship. It's simply a cross plot. I'm not showing it to you here. And I plugged in the numbers for Coachella Valley. So Coachella Valley has, these numbers look big, 18.6% for Monterey, right? Coachella's share is 28% of leisure and hospitality, of non-farm jobs. So the predicted, from this relationship across MSAs in California, the predicted decrease in employment for the Coachella Valley is 23%. That's where Joe comes up with these unemployment rates for the Coachella Valley of over 30%, right? And that doesn't even take into account changes in the labor force, people becoming discouraged. So I want to continue to work more on that, as well as for the recovery. This graph only looks difficult. It's not as difficult as you might think. It's very similar to the one I showed before in gray. So here again, in the United States, is the loss in employment in each one of the major industries and the subsequent increase in jobs following April, right? So what do we see? Leisure and hospitality had lost 8 million jobs. They've recovered not quite half. The number of jobs that we lost in leisure and hospitality in the United States is 23% of employment that existed in February in that sector, right? Some of the sectors have done worse, other services, but they're just smaller, as you can see. So there's not that much of an effect. So right now, it's unfortunately for the Coachella Valley, it's all about leisure and hospitality. What is the effect of an increase in the unemployment rate, of loss in employment? Well, loss in employment is here. This is the change in the labor force. If I could draw a 45-degree line through it, you would see that everyone, if it's above it, has had an increase in the unemployment rate. How's the Inland Empire doing? No, not particularly poorly, not particularly bad. Los Angeles is down here, over 15% loss in employment. Okay, so where do we stand now? This is after the disaster of April. Here's something that some of you find hard to understand. We had a huge increase in GDP in the second quarter of 33%. And you will say, well, it went down by 31%, goes up by 33%. Shouldn't we be back where we started from? Make yourself a simple example. Let's say the stock market is at 100. And if it shrinks by 50%, it's not a trick question. It goes down to 50. And if it now grows by 50%, where does it end up? 75%, right? That's the problem when you do percentages. So in order to get back to where we started, we would require to have 15.2% growth in the fourth quarter. That's not going to happen. Right? So by year's end, we will definitely not be back where we were. best estimates what the economy is doing now is the Federal Reserve in Atlanta has a GDP now estimate, and it says 5%. I even find that high. With the new shutdowns, my belief is it will be much less. Unemployment rate in the United States, I have to admit, I'm surprised how fast it came down from what it was. We were at a high of 14.7%. I did not think that at this point we're down to 6.9%. But our forecast until the end of the year is certainly, that's not going to continue. As a matter of fact, we see the unemployment rate going up a little at the end of, in December. Here's the recovery, April to September. If you're on that line, the unemployment rate doesn't change. If you're below it, the unemployment rate goes down. The further you are out to the northeast, the better. It means employment is growing and people are coming back in the labor force. There's Los Angeles, right? Not doing so poorly. Inland Empire, in the middle of the pack, right? These places here, Imperial County in particular, they're doing poorly. Slow. San Luis Obispo, not doing so well. What is the shape of this recession? So several letters have been thrown around. One person in particular seems to think that it is a V. And some of the graphs did look like a V. Sharp decline, bounce back. You switch off the lights, you switch them back on, and you're back to where you were. We found that implausible. However, so far that person is not that far off. The alternative was to think sort of a U with a long bottom. That is not happening. So we did go down, but we did come up. Our forecast at the beginning of the year was more like the old Verizon V or Nike swoosh, right? Old Verizon V meant you came down fast and then it would take a long time, sort of like after the Great Recession to recover. And that's not true. So the recovery so far has been fairly fast. We now think that you're going to be stuck. So it's as if you were drawing the sign for a square root. You reverse it, right? So it looks like this. So we're going to flatten out. There is fear of a W, which would mean a double dip recession. So that would happen if the coronavirus is not under control in the first quarter. We could see another decline. Here's something that Joe alluded to as well, a K-shaped recession. What the hell is that? A K-shape means there are some people who have done very well. That's the upper arm of the K. They saw a decline. They've almost recovered. But it's the lower half of the income distribution that really has suffered, right? So not only did they say a decline and they see a decline in their income, but not much has changed. Females are, by the way, proportionally overrepresented in that group, and it's because a lot of females work in leisure and hospitality, right? Okay. Finally getting to the Coachella Valley. I'm sorry that I spent so much time this year on California and on the United States, but you just had to understand certain facts. That if you don't get those down, it's hard to understand what's going on in the Coachella Valley. So that is the economy in the Coachella Valley from March to April. It's also very similar to a picture that was taken of me about 10 years ago down the Kern River. And I was the one who had the out-of-boat experience. And I tell you, that's not nice. Right? At some point we were told not to drink the water because upstream, deers and whatever animals were releasing themselves into the water. I think when I came out at the bottom of the Category 4, I must have had about 3 gallons of water. It was it was an interesting experience. This in many ways tells it all, right? I said this before, if you ever wanted to see a picture of seasonal variation, look at either employment or look at passenger traffic in Palm Springs, LAX by comparison, right? So the high-end passenger and traffic is, I mean, we all know this, we don't have to think about it, is March, right? And when is the low? June to August. I mean, at some point I came to CVAP's offices in June, this was about 3 years ago, and the temperature was 122 degrees, right? You don't necessarily want to be in the Coachella Valley then, right? When do you want to be in the Coachella Valley? Well, once the fall starts, right? And so here's the decline in passenger traffic. I mean, we saw a decline in April from last year of 97%. 90%, 70% of passenger traffic is what we're down on. We're not alone. You can see this with LAX, right? Their seasonal pattern is a bit different. By September, which is the latest number available, we're still off by 54%, right? Here comes the problem. Coachella Valley's tourist season is different from what most others experience. This is the time when we really want to see the snowbirds come, right? This is the time when we want to see the direct flights from Alberta and from British Columbia, WestJet and Air Canada coming down. And the Canadians are not allowed to fly. They're allowed to drive, right? But they can't fly. It's the same thing with people from Chicago. Not quite the same. They can fly here. But they won't come anymore like they used to come. Maybe they will come again by the spring. But our main season is now, right? That's the problem, okay? We already know that Coachella is not going to happen, the festival is not going to happen in April. Let's hope it happens by October, right? So it's going to be a difficult spring, but hopefully we're rebounding. Here is Joe's picture of employment losses in the Coachella Valley. Right? This is how much we lost. Here's the good news. We're still down by a lot, but we're catching up compared to the United States, the Inland Empire, and California. Right? We're still down by a lot, but at least we're on that same trajectory that we were at before. David Robinson helped me with these graphs. I urge you to go to a site at Harvard University run by Chetty, and it's called the recovery.org. And what you can do is you can type in the loss in small business revenue, and it's measured through credit card transactions by zip code. And the amazing thing is, if you do that the areas that lost the most are the wealthy areas. So I teach at Claremont McKenna College. Claremont, the city of Claremont, lost 82% of its revenue. I live in Upland, and Upland actually gained 2% of revenue. It's the same thing in the Coachella Valley. And David developed this just in terms of 3 colors. You can click on any zip code and it will tell you by credit card transactions how much revenue went down in that first phase. Right? Here's the picture for the Coachella Valley of the sectors we looked at before. Right? And again, no surprises there. It's leisure and hospitality that has gone down by the most. And again, unfortunately not recovered that much. Guess which cities lost the most employment? The cities with the most leisure and hospitality, right? So Palm Desert, Palm Springs, right? In detail, you will be able to see it. On the right side, that looks a bit different because employment, of course, is measured there in terms of percentages. And so if you have leisure hospitality as a small share, it will show up in a big way here. I had asked not to write a report at this point because the report is always due a month before our conference. And the problem is that EDD, basically the Department of Labor in California, releases data on employment with a delay. And until last Friday, we would not have the red data here. The red data is from March until April. I would have been standing here talking to you about data from January until March. You would have said, who cares? Right? That data became available on Friday. We had begged the Department of Labor to release it to us one day earlier, so we got that data. And all that we did is we projected by sector now where we are, basically by sector, by looking at sectors in the Inland Empire. So that will be available to you when the report appears. Another interesting sector aspect that David and I have been discussing is the following. California is a big state. Should it really be true that in areas that are largely dispersed, that you should have the same color code everywhere? So purple is the most restrictive, right? Yellow is what San Francisco, by the way, was on until last week. They're now red. So it's purple, red, orange, yellow, right? We want to be in the yellow. That's when you're allowed to have crowds going to festivals, okay? So I asked David to make a color-coded map of the Coachella Valley and a little bit of the area outside. And I'd hoped to see big variations so that we could say, perhaps, places like Indio should be allowed to open or so. Maybe Palm Springs should just be shut down or so. But using the current criteria that California has, which is basically 7 new cases per day divided by the population in the area multiplied by 100,000, it doesn't allow for a lot of variation at the moment as the virus comes back up. David also looked at how much of a change there has been over the last week. There's a bit more variation. Some areas are really not doing very well. They're getting worse. Others are doing slightly better. Something else that was mentioned before is the real estate factor. The only bright spot, and I'm fully aware of the fact that I'm running out of time for the 12 o'clock news, so let me click through this in a bit of a hurry. The real estate sector was really badly affected in Riverside County during the coronavirus. But if you look at it, the listings are back up to where they were over the last 2 years. And one of the reasons, of course, is that mortgage rates are so low at the moment that people either, if they can, buy a new house or refinance. We've listed for the report the changes in sales and prices for the various counties. As you can see, Riverside and San Bernardino not only have seen large increases in sale prices, but also in sales themselves. Here's the Coachella Valley real estate, and we're listing them by city. Interesting enough, Coachella, of course, in the second quarter was down by quite a lot, but we're doing well compared to the 2 previous years, which is what Joe was alluding to, right? Year to year, sales and quantities are up by substantial amounts. This does not bring into account affordability, of course. And having a lean supply drives up prices. Overall, there are mixed signals in the housing sector. We'll talk about them more when we release the housing report for the Coachella Valley. And in essence, what we have here is a situation of a booming sector. Something a little bit disturbing in the Coachella Valley, and again, Joe referred to this, housing starts are not as good as you might hope. So it is new houses that are not coming online. And all of those new houses also are single-family units, right? So we hope that, again, getting more housing starts is what we're looking for. And we'll finish that in our report by giving more details of the housing sector. I want to finish with one last slide, which is the title page from this week's Economist. And it shows a light at the end of the tunnel. And that light at the end of the tunnel is the vaccine. Right? That's what we have to hope for. And when it will be here and distributed to everyone, by the end of the second quarter, things will turn around. And let me give you something positive on the way out. Household finances and firm finances are actually doing surprisingly well. Households have saved a lot of money, so there's a lot of pent-up demand. So come next fall, we will do well. And so it's just a question of hanging on to it until then. Thank you very much.